Hey there, it's Silver. This is First Dwarf. So this is it's an action RPG, ostensibly, but it's also got some like base building and tower defense elements and maybe a little teeny bit of like survival-y stuff in there too. The idea is you play a dwarf and you have a mech, so I was already in as soon as I saw that, and your mech is a very cool looking design that's very much like sort of dungeon punk / steampunk looking machinery. It's pretty cool, and you are on this series of floating islands that are corrupted by this evil force. And you've got to make your way across the islands, building up various bases that can hopefully self-sustain, get you the resources that you need, and defend themselves from this incoming menace, as well as destroying the nests of monsters yourself to clear out the islands as you go. So it'll start off pretty simple. You'll just be gathering some resources in the pretty traditional way. You've got a mech, so you can smack trees and rocks to get some wood and stone. But eventually you'll need to start building a base somewhere. So you'll set down a couple of basic buildings, like the sort of starting nexus building that you'll need to do everything. And then, of course, you're going to want some resource gathering buildings, because you don't want to constantly be traipsing around the island, gathering it all yourself manually. You want some of this happening in the background. So you can build some forestry and stone mining buildings to actually get a constant income of those resources on that island. And each island's sort of inventory of resources and buildings is individual. So what you have on one island doesn't affect the other islands, which is kind of weird, but that's how it works. But eventually night is gonna fall, and when night falls, things get a little bit dicey, because all of the monster spawners on that particular island will spawn monsters, and they'll all automatically know where your base is, of course, and come running to destroy everything. And they will destroy any building they can, so you want to fight them off. Now, you yourself can fight pretty well. You have a mech, obviously, so you just swing your axe around and stuff and kill monsters, and you have this sort of rhythm-based attack combo, where when you do a basic attack, it shows this little gauge, and if you hit the attack button again when these indicators are within the gauge at the right time, it'll turn green, and you'll do a second and third combo hit and keep going until you finish your like 5-hit combo with a sort of more powerful big sweep at the end. So there is a reason not to just spam the attack button. If you do it in the right rhythm, you'll do a better combo. But of course, it's not just about killing things yourself. You want these bases to be self-sufficient, so you can also dive into some of the more tower defensey elements. You can build walls around the place, and walls don't take that many resources, so it's not too hard to build them. You can also build gates, and you can build turrets of various kinds. At first, you'll only have a basic crossbow turret that is relatively effective. So you can plop down some walls with some gates in them so that you can still walk past them, and some turrets behind those walls to start shooting at enemies that come to batter them down. However, something I didn't mention is that you also need power. There is mana in this world, and everything is powered by a flow of mana. You will find these mana fissures in the ground, and on top of the fissures you can build these sort of mana generators or mines that will create power at that spot. So this does limit where you want to build a base, because you don't want to be piping mana across a really long distance, because each of those pipes is going to be something else that can be potentially attacked later. But once you have one of these mana wells set up, you can build pipelines. They are all above ground, and just pipe all that mana to all the various things in your base that need it. Obviously the turrets need it, all of your production buildings like the stone and wood production need it, gates actually need it to be able to open and close, so that's pretty important. And also not just your main building, but eventually you're going to want to build homes, because after you have secured parts of an island, you can build a power setup for a big beacon somewhere on the island. And when you do this, it calls a ship full of dwarves to come live on that island, because that's sort of what you're here for, is to create a livable space and make everything safe for all of these guys. So you're going to want some homes that are also powered and have all of the things that they need, like wells for water and stuff like that, around this area to actually make it into a full-on settlement. A settlement in this game isn't just production buildings and turrets, it also needs homes and things. And eventually, once you get a good amount of stuff and a settlement, then you'll start to build some of the more advanced stuff like a research station, so that you can research new technologies on the tech tree, and then use some of those technologies to expand your reach and get to new islands, where you will repeat this process over again, but in a more complicated way, because new islands have new dangers on them. There's also a bit of like a puzzle solving element that I quite enjoyed the idea of, because different islands have different bits of like ancient infrastructure already on them that you need to get working in different ways and stuff, and these can expand your horizons even further. So you want to get them working, so not only are you trying to build new settlements on new islands, you're also trying to understand what that island has that's unique to it and what it can do for you and how to incorporate that into your settlement. And eventually you're going to be expanding out to the point of, losing some stuff. You're going to lose buildings, and you're going to get attacked on too many sides, and maybe you didn't expect how some of the spawners were placed and stuff, so you are going to have to rebuild occasionally, and this is going to give you a taste of the sort of resource conservation gameplay that is specific to the fact that each island has its own resource budget. So all of the wood and stone you gather on one island does not transition to other islands. It is just there, and you can only access that pool of resources when you're on that island to build. So it sort of becomes about making these self-sufficient bases on each one that are safe from enemies while striking out in various directions to destroy the enemy spawners so that your bases have an easier time defending themselves, but also trying to figure out what is unique about that island, if there's like some ancient machinery that you need to get working, and usually there's like several multifaceted quests that have several steps to complete to actually do whatever it is that island does. And of course, during all this, you're going to be researching new technologies that help you out. So things like a jetpack to get to new islands and navigate current islands easier. Things like weaponized arms of various kinds so that you can combat the more advanced creatures and stuff. And also, you'll find that the main area of your base, the sort of main base nexus building, it can be upgraded with various things that will enhance its capabilities, allowing you to produce stuff at it that is more advanced than the resource production nodes. So you can get things like an alchemy station to produce water purification potions to purify big corrupted lakes on islands. So overall, I like the idea here. I like the big mech. I enjoy the basic gameplay loop, but I do have a couple of really big overarching problems with the game, unfortunately, as it currently stands. And the main one I think I just want to start with is I think it's just too early. Earlier on in Early Access's lifespan, we had a lot of games that were very early, like alphas, 0.01 versions of games, and a lot of people kind of caught on to the fact that that was not really a good idea, that wasn't a good way to use the Early Access system, and a lot of those did not get finished and were eventually abandoned. And so over time, the way that Early Access currently works is a lot more consumer friendly, because we have, like mid to late betas coming into Early Access that only need like 6 to 12 months of work and already have a substantial amount of content and a substantial amount of polish on the content that they do have. So the bar for where you put your Early Access game has been raised, I feel, by games like Hades and No Rest for the Wicked as a more recent example to reinforce what I'm talking about. We're talking about games that have a lot of polish already. The days of putting up a really, really early alpha are kind of past us, and that's not really considered acceptable to do in the modern Early Access system anymore. And I feel that under those standards, this game is just too early right now. It has a lot of problems with how it currently works and a lot of bugs and stuff that make it very difficult to play for any length of time because things constantly mess up. It's also really bad at telling you what to do. At one point, you, for instance, have to use the aforementioned water purification potion to purify an island's lake. And a lot of people are on the Steam forums thinking that this soft locks your game when you get here. It actually doesn't, but the way that you need to do it is just not really clear, to the point that a lot of people think that they're screwed when they're not. And that's just how bad the game is at sort of telling you what to do. You see, you have to build an alchemy station in order to use this potion, but you can make the potion without an alchemy station for some reason. As long as you have the resources, you can just make it whenever you want, but you can't actually put it in the water until you have an alchemy station. But in order to get an alchemy station, you have to research it. But in order to research it, you have to have a research center, and you can't build one of those on the island that you're on. You have to go back to your previous one and use that one. And there's a lot of things like that in this game that just aren't very clear and feel like they may be breaking or maybe just not explained very well. It's hard to tell which. For instance, you can do a really cool thing, which is switch to a dragon's point of view and fly around. This allows you to get to areas you can't otherwise get to with your mech, and the dragon can also breathe fire, which can kill enemies and also destroy certain environmental hazards and things that you need to get out of the way, like big brambles and stuff. You can also build as this dragon, which is pretty cool because it gives the building more of an RTS feel since you're much higher up and you can kind of build from a different perspective, except the building as a dragon currently doesn't really work very well. Sometimes it doesn't work at all, and it just seems very buggy and implemented in a way that doesn't really work. The way the building system works is also very frustrating right now. For instance, up until the most recent update, you actually couldn't use walls correctly at all. They were basically useless because walls could not be built very close to cliff sides or any of the other areas that were highlighted in red when you went to build, which means that every time you built a wall, it by design had to have a huge gap in it where enemies could just walk around it. So walls were effectively useless. They have since changed this and made it a little bit more reasonable to where you can actually build closer to edges and stuff now. I sort of wonder what the idea behind setting it like that in the first place actually was, but as of right now, walls are more useful than before, but they still have really weird behaviors, sometimes jutting out at odd angles even though you didn't build them that way, or otherwise just sort of putting themselves in areas that create huge gaps, thus making walls useless. You also, for some reason, can't repair destroyed buildings. You have to actually demolish a destroyed building and rebuild it on its same place. You can't just replace it with a new one or anything like that. There is no shorthand way of doing that, which means if you get raided and a whole bunch of your buildings get destroyed, you basically have to erase your entire settlement and start over every single time this happens. And this happens a lot for a couple of reasons. For one, the way that enemies spawn is very bizarre. They will constantly spawn large waves of enemies completely silently in places without telling you, and you'll just be getting your base destroyed. There isn't even like a your base is under attack warning or anything. It's just suddenly enemies pour in and everything gets destroyed, and you would have had no idea unless you were there. And even if you were there, it's unlikely you would have been able to do much about it because it spawns such an absurd number of enemies in complete silence, by the way, that you can't really do much about it. You will sometimes have to face a couple dozen enemies or more that just appear out of nowhere with no fanfare at all, and there's not much you can do to stop that from happening. There are a limited number of enemy spawners, but it doesn't seem like they're all active when you actually come to an island, and instead they just activate randomly with no warning on some nights, and you have no guarantee as to which ones will activate, which means you won't know where your walls are supposed to be because you won't know where the enemies are coming from because it doesn't tell you. There are also just loads of general bugs and stuff, from falling through things that you shouldn't fall through, to enemies spawning and disappearing randomly, to hitboxes being really wonky, sometimes hitting enemies, sometimes not, just on a random whim, it feels like. Enemies being able to sometimes destroy things instantly for no reason, seemingly, and turrets just sometimes ignoring enemies entirely and deciding not to shoot at all despite being powered. Basically, I could go on and on about a whole bunch of tiny little issues, but they don't really matter right now because the main issue is it's just severely lacking content and polish right now, and it's selling for $25, which is an insane price for how little there is here to actually go through at the moment. I really like a lot of the ideas on display. I like the mech, I like the aesthetic, I like the gameplay loop in theory, but in practice everything is so janky and so annoying to deal with, and just everything about this game in general is so frustrating that it just doesn't really feel worth suffering through some of the issues at the moment, because there are just issues everywhere. Even little things annoy me about this game, like the way that sometimes when you want to build a mana pipeline from a mana generating building to a building that needs it, sometimes you can just build the pipeline straight from one building to the other. Other times it just randomly disappears and doesn't work, and you have to build a bunch of nodes around the place first before the mana will actually connect. Sometimes the mana pipeline will just disconnect itself and buildings will stop receiving power even though they're still connected physically, and there's no reason this should be happening. They just stop receiving power for no reason. There's just a load of little annoyances that build up to a tremendous feeling of there's like zero polish here, and for the price they're asking, $25, there should be significantly more polish. Basically, the way that the current modern early access standards tend to work is that you either put up a game that has a tremendous amount of content and some polish, or you put up a game that has a smaller amount of content but a load of polish on the content that's already there, and and only put in new content once it meets that polished standard. However, this game has very little of both. It doesn't have much content and it has very little polish on what's already there, and I feel like we're past a point in early access where that is acceptable, especially for $25. So currently, I unfortunately cannot recommend First Dwarf, even though I really like the idea of it, just because it's uncomfortably low in content and polish, and I'm just not comfortable saying that you should spend that much money on something like this at this time. It is something to keep an eye on, though, because I do have a feeling that it will have more content and more polish eventually, and it will be worth keeping an eye on for when that happens, because there are a lot of really cool ideas here. So I would personally recommend wishlisting it, and that way you can keep an eye on its updates, and I will most likely revisit this in the future when I can be a little bit more favorable to it because a lot of my problems have been solved. So I'll go ahead and put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page for First Dwarf so that you can go and perhaps wishlist it or keep an eye on it yourself. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.